All right, well, first off, this is a presentation on antique firearms. So what is an antique firearm, okay? By statutes, it says it's a firearm made in 1898 or older, or a black powder replica thereof. So basically, why do we say 1898? That law came into effect in the 60s, 1968 actually. And what they did is they picked a date when basically everything switched from a black powder to smokeless powder. The difference between black powder and smokeless powder is black powder is an explosion. It's an explosion like that. It goes in all directions, right? It makes a big puff of smoke. Smokeless powder is a propellant. That's the main difference. It's much more force behind it. It doesn't have, you don't get that big puff of smoke, and it's designed to be a propellant. It would take a scientist to tell you what all the differences, you know, the finite details. I don't really know off the top of my head, but I do know that black powder doesn't have near as much force behind it, and that's one of the reasons why these guns tend to be exempted from the modern firearms laws. That's kind of the cutoff in there. They don't, anything that shoots a modern bullet that you can go down to the sporting goods store and buy, they don't want you trading those without going through the FFL paperwork, the federal firearms laws. They want to do a background check and all that kind of stuff if you're trading in modern firearms. Antique firearms do not need any transfer paperwork or any background checks or anything. They're actually considered a curio or a relic by the federal government. So that's nice. So everything on this table here is an antique. That means that if I want to sell it to you, it's a matter of cash and carry. You know, you give me the money, I give you the gun, and you go on. The federal government doesn't get involved in these kinds of firearms, which is nice. I don't think the federal government needs to be in everyone's business all the time. Anyways, when did firearms first come about? Does anyone know what the oldest gun recorded is? Anyone know that?
700-ish?
No, actually, right in the oldest gun that they know of that's in a museum has been dated to 1288.
Wow.
So the Chinese actually invented powder and guns, right? And in 1288, they found a gun that dates back to 1288 with carbon dating. Generally, the kind of accepted rule is firearms were invented about 1300. Okay, so that's a long time ago, 1300 in China. So the antique period covers anything from about 1300 to 1898. That's, you know, that's almost 600-year period right there. The first improvement, major improvement in firearms came about 100 years or so after they were invented. And the first device to actually automatically fire a gun was called a matchlock. Okay, so up till, you know, the first 100 years or so, you're basically touching off the powder with a torch or whatever and making it fire. Well, about 1400, the matchlock was invented. The matchlock was invented, the Portuguese are credited with inventing a matchlock. And basically what that was is it was a serpentine where they would light like a wick or a slow burning match. They would light it, and they would pull the trigger and it would come around and then light the powder in the flash pan, which was a primer powder, which then exploded the main charge in the barrel, right? So you could actually have two hands on your gun at this point. You could light it and then, you know, aim. It was a great improvement. So after the matchlock, the next major invention that came in, improvement that came along around 100 years or so later in the early 1500s, and it was called a wheel lock. So the wheel lock was, you know, another big improvement. You know, you didn't have to sit there and light you didn't have to light it with a torch or a burning match or whatever. It was more of an automatic type of thing, which was big. Now the in the wheel lock was very complicated. It was made. It was invented in Germany, right? And those guys were making clocks and all kinds of stuff that were real high tech at that time. And it was almost as complex as the watches and stuff. It was very complex. It was expensive to produce, so a lot of people were still using the matchlocks. And so the matchlocks and wheel locks were both produced side by side there for a long period before the technology for producing the lock system got affordable enough and more people quit using a matchlock. Along the way, about 1540 or so, they had a device called a snap lock, and then in 1560 or so a snap hands. But those were just basically small improvements made to the wheel lock system. The next major improvement for antique firearms come around 1600, and it was called a flintlock. Now, with a flintlock, it was the first time that we see where you're cocking a trigger. Okay, and you basically, when you cocked that trigger, it had a little pair of grips similar to this, and you had a piece of flint in there, and when you pulled, or your hammer, I mean, when you pulled the hammer back, it had a little piece of flint in there, and it would fall forward, striking the frizzen, they called it, and it would create spark in the flash pan, which ignited your primer charge, which ignited your main charge, which made it fire. So it was an improvement, but still a long ways away from where we wind up today. The other thing about those antique guns like a flintlock and stuff is they were big and heavy. These were all made, they were hand forged, with a blacksmith. They were heavy, they were big and long. Accuracy was not all that great. I mean, basically an explosion is happening in the back end of that barrel, which is propelling a lead ball out. And, today a rifle will shoot, way over there with great accuracy and speed. Back then they would go more like that. So anyways, for about 200 years, from 16 till the early 1800s, the flintlock was king. I mean, there wasn't a lot of major improvements during that time period. But then we're going to get to the early 1800s. This is my favorite period of antique guns. In the early 1800s is when the percussion system was invented. And what a percussion is, actually, this little pistol right here was made about 1830, okay? And a percussion system was, there was a little cap that had some fulminate of mercury in one end, and it would fit over the nipple. You can see the nipple right here. You fit over the nipple. The nipple's hollow through into the back of the barrel. And so the guy, he would put his powder charge down there, and he'd put his patch and his ball, and he would tamp it down. And then you put a little cap over your nipple in the back there. You cock it, and whenever you fired it, the hammer hit the little cap, made the tiny explosion that went through the nipple into the back of the barrel, and that fired it. It was a great improvement. We're no longer relying on spark, or things like that. Weather became a lot less of a factor at that point, and it was just a huge improvement. Here, you want to show that around, Rowdy? That gun there was about 1830. This one here is about late 1840s. But yeah, so anyways, the first 50 years or so of the 1800s, we had the percussion system. Then, mid 1800s, huge thing comes along. They figured out how to combine your explosive material and your bullet all into one. They come up with a metallic cartridge. So then your little explosion, your fulminate of mercury explosion that was in the percussion caps in the back, they figured out how to encapsulate that in the back of a metal cartridge. You fill the metal cartridge with powder, and then you seat a lead ball at the end of it there. It's all in one metallic cartridge. That's what most of these rifles and guns are here on the table. And so that was a huge improvement. Now weather's not a factor at all. I mean, you can drop your cartridge in the river, pull it out, put it back in your gun, and fire it. You know, whereas even the percussion system was still a little susceptible to your powder getting wet and things like that, and it not exploding right. It was a huge improvement over the other systems, but it still wasn't foolproof. But now, I mean, we're coming along with some major advancements. After the metallic cartridge was invented, people had been working with the idea of multiple shot firearms around that point already. In about the 1840s, a guy in France had invented what they call a pepper box, which was where they would load several barrels, and a pepper box gun has from 4 to 6 barrels, and whenever you fire it, the barrels go around like that, similar to like a Gatling gun or something. Okay, then in about 1852 or so, a man named Roland White, he patented the idea of a revolving cylinder pistol, where you load it from the back with a metallic cartridge, and whenever you pull the trigger back, the cylinder's going around. So now you just need one barrel, right? And you load anywhere from 4 to 6 shots in your revolving cylinder. As we close out the period of antique firearms, which is the late 1890s, you have stuff like semi-automatic pistols being invented by John Browning. You have the invention of smokeless powder, which is what modern firearms shoot to this day. Basically, if you think about it, I mean, if you have a Glock or a SIG or any of those today, your modern firearm today, the grandfather to that was already in place at the end of the 1800s, okay, or right around 1900. So there hasn't been any huge innovations, from the late 1800s to now. Guns have gotten lighter. They make them out of hard black plastic, and they've gotten lighter and faster, and some things like that. But the grandfather of everything that we fire today had been invented by 1898, 1900, right in there. So if you think about the period of the 1800s, they started off that period with a flintlock and wound up with semi-automatic handguns. I mean, that's how far they came in that 100-year period. Now, I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the collecting of antique firearms. The absolute most collected firearms from that time period are the Colt single-action pistol and the lever-action repeating Winchester rifles. That's what that's what every basic collector starts with, is either a Colt pistol or a lever-action Winchester. There's a lot of specialties, in and out, and advanced collectors get off on different tangents. But so the lever-action repeating rifle, this started with a Henry model. Okay, the Henry came out about 1860. It was made by the New Haven Arms Company. From 1860 to 1866, there was about 14,000 of these made. This gun I'm holding right here is an authentic Henry rifle, made in about 1862, and this was huge because the Civil War's going on, and they would talk. There was an old saying, they would talk about, the Southerners would talk about them Yankees, because mostly the Northerners had these. They'd talk about them Yankees who had a gun that started firing on Monday and didn't quit till Sunday. Wealthy people would buy one of these and send them to their relatives or whatever who were fighting in the war. The U.S. government actually ordered 1,700 more or less of these for trial with their army, and all of those 1,700 were inspected by the arms inspector for the Union Army, and we're very fortunate to actually have one right here that is inspected by the Union Army's government inspector. So this is actually one of about 1,700 out of those 14,000. So this is an extremely rare valuable gun. The yellow boys, the Model 66s, they wound up making about 160,000 of these total. So you can find them. They're generally, fairly expensive, but you can find them. Out of that 160,000, I don't know, there's probably still 100,000 of them out there somewhere. So they're rare, but they're not extremely rare. The thing about a Model 92 is you see the Model 92s a lot in Western movies because they became popular. One of the things that was real popular about them is Chuck Connors was the first guy to do it. He had a Model 92 with that big loop right there. They modified the lever. That wasn't from original to the gun, right? They modified it and made a big loop because he had big hands. He's a big man. John Wayne caught onto that real quick, and he wanted one too. So Chuck Connors and John Wayne both used Model 92s a lot in their movies with that big loop, and they've actually came out with commemorative models. Winchester produced commemorative models of 92s with that big loop, and people buy them with that big loop on them. A kind of an interesting fact about the 92 is you'll see a lot of 92s in Western movies, but the period that they're depicting might be from the 1870s or 80s, and here these guys are carrying Model 92s around. As we get towards the end of the antique period, Winchester came out with the Model 94. The Model 94 is by far the most prolific Winchester ever. Anyone who grew up deer hunting with a 30-30 or had one of these in the gun rack in the back of their pickup probably had a Model 94. It was the first model to use smokeless powder. So that was the main change between all these and one of these, is this one used the new smokeless powder. There was around 7.5 million of these produced from 1894 to, they still produced them up till a few years ago. So these were very prolific guns. Kind of an interesting fact about the Model 92s is only around the first 350,000 of them, or Model 94, only around the first 350,000 Model 94s were actually made in what we consider the Old West period, before the turn of the century. And therefore, the ones made after the turn of the century don't carry as much value as the first 350,000 that are considered a curio or a relic. And it's unfortunate, but anytime there's money involved in anything, this Colt pistol here is worth a minimum $3,500. Some people might want as much as $5,000. That's kind of the range. It's probably worth $3,500, $4,000, maybe $4,250. So that's a lot of money for a Colt that's all right. So there's a lot of these guys who are really good at taking parts from junk guns, which you can buy for almost nothing, and they assemble them all together, and they go through and make it look like it's an original untouched gun. There's a lot of guys that are good at it. And so you really got to watch out for that, because a junk gun is worth a few $100, but something that's all intact is worth a few thousand. So just be real cautious of that. If you want to get into collecting the antique firearms, you don't have to break the bank. We're throwing some big numbers out here right now, but you can find things in the $1,000 range, which are very collectible. And it's a good entry level point. But always go to somebody who will stand behind what they sell and knows what they're talking about. And if they get it wrong, I don't know everything there is to know about everything, but if I get it wrong, if I sell you that gun and you come back to me and say, hey, I called John Kopek on it and he said that this has been replaced in there, and I didn't know it and didn't disclose it, I'll take it back. I don't want anything out there with my name on it that isn't right. I'll stand behind it. And go to somebody like that for sure, unless you're the expert yourself. Which it's not hard to become one. Just go buy a few thousand of them, and when you buy when you buy a bad one, that's the quickest. The best education that I've ever got is buying the wrong stuff and paying a lot of money for something I thought was right that wasn't, and taken a hit on it. That gave me the quickest education.
And where are you guys from?
Chandler, Arizona.
And what did you think of the presentation
Oh, it was
today?
very informative.
I loved it.
I thought it was very, so much information. I was very impressed.